I'm going to talk with you about how to cope with people who set themselves up as your critics. We've all got critics. I've had a fair share of them in my time. All of us have people around us who tell us whether we dress right, talk right, think right, or do right. Critics can make us feel guilty or ashamed or just plain incompetent if we let them. So one of the most important lessons about life that I, for one, am still learning, and maybe you are too, is this: how to cope with those who criticize us. There are two mistakes people often make when they're trying to cope with their critics. One mistake is to ignore them. But the trouble with ignoring our critics is that we just may discover that they were right and that we would have been better off if we had listened to them. So it's a mistake to ignore our critics. On the other hand, it's even a bigger mistake to take them too seriously, to let them have the last word, as if they were our judges, and as if they were always right. The trick, then, is to listen to our critics, but never let our critics become our judges. Here's the key. A critic is one thing, a judge is another. Critics give us their own opinion, and it's up to us to take it or leave it. But judges are different. When they deliver their judgment, we have no choice. We simply have to take it. This is why I say, listen to your critics, but never let them be your judges. The Apostle Paul had his share of critics. And what he said to his critics has always been very helpful to me. I recommend it to you too. You can find his words in the New Testament at the very beginning of the 4th chapter of 1 Corinthians. Listen, with me, it is a small thing that I should be judged by you, or anybody else for that matter. I do not even judge myself. It's the Lord who judges me. You'll notice that he had 3 kinds of critics. First, other people. Second, himself. And third, the Lord. 3 critics. And we have the very same ones. Other people, our own selves, and the Lord. Let's first talk about our other human critics, our friends, people who go to our church, our mothers, or even our own children. They can criticize us for just about everything. The apostles' critics, for instance, were carping at him for the way he carried on his missionary work. How did he respond? He simply said, I'm listening. I hear what you're saying, and what you say matters to me. But when the chips are down and you've had your say, your words are never the last word for me. You are not my judges. When we let our critics become our judges, we let them decide whether we are good enough or beautiful enough to be loved and accepted. I knew a woman once who had just about everything a beautiful woman, 50-ish, could want. Besides being very good looking, she was well educated and wealthy, and on top of that, most important, she was a very good, generous human being. But with all her fine qualities, she was miserable, deeply miserable and depressed. Sometimes she thought of taking her own life. How did she get in that terribly sad state of mind? I'll tell you. She got into that sad state of mind by letting her critics become her judges. She had lived her whole life to win their approval. She lived in fear that if she did not measure up to their judgments, she would not be good enough. Not good enough for anyone, especially God. Not good even for God to love her. Well, what happened to this wonderful woman? I'm happy to say that she finally learned how to deal with her critics. She found the courage to say to them, I respect your criticism, but from now on, I will not let you be my judge. Very often, we have the hardest time when our critics are the very people we love and admire. When I was in college, I had a wonderful teacher, one of the great ones whom I much admired. And I wanted his approval above almost everything else. If I did not have his approval, I would feel crushed. In short, I was letting my professor and my critic be my judge. Took me a long time, too long, to say to myself, I want him to be my critic. I will always take his opinion seriously, but I will not let him be my judge. I can tell you that the day I decided that my college idol would not be my judge, I found a new freedom to follow my own path without worrying about what he thought of what I was doing. Critics are a blessing. We can all profit from them. But they can be a curse if we let them be our judges. Let's get on to our second critic. And that second critic is nobody else but our own self. God has made us, I believe, with the ability to examine our own lives, to take stock of ourselves, and be our own critics. The only way we will ever improve our lives is by being critical of ourselves. But we make a huge mistake if we become our own judges. The Apostle Paul knew that. So when he refused to let his critics be his judges, he added these words, I do not even judge myself. Let me repeat that. I do not even judge myself. It's important here to recall the difference between a critic and a judge. A critic gives you his or her opinion, and you can accept it or you can reject it. But when a judge pronounces his or her judgment, you're stuck with it. The Apostle Paul knew that. And though he was his own toughest critic, a man who took the measure of his own life and work and criticized himself very honestly, after all, he's the apostle who said, for the whole world to know, I find that I often do the very things that in my deepest spirit I do not really want to do. And I often fail to do the very things that deep in my spirit I really want to do. Yes, the apostle was his own toughest critic, and he urged us to examine ourselves and be critical of what we see in ourselves, but be our own judges, not on your life. We're simply not competent to judge ourselves. When we take stock of ourselves, we tend to see what we want to see. When we're feeling good about ourselves, we want to see only the good things about ourselves. And when we get down on ourselves, as all of us do, we actually look for bad things in ourselves. How we see ourselves is always blurred by the mood we are in. When we feel good about ourselves, we're too easy on ourselves. When we feel down, depressed, we're too hard on ourselves. The Bible says that all our hearts are deceitful, and they never deceive us so badly as when we are trying to examine our own lives. Besides, we're just too complicated for us to understand ourselves. And even when we're honest with ourselves, the smartest psychiatrist in the world could spend 5 years with any one of us and never really unravel the mystery of who and what we are. Look inside yourself, and you'll find shadow and light, evil and goodness, ugliness and beauty, hate and love, all mixed up together like a tossed salad. I worry about people who, when they look inside themselves, always come up feeling smug and thoroughly pleased with what they see. But I also worry about people who look inside themselves and come up feeling as if their souls were cesspools. And neither of these people has seen themselves for what they really are. We're not angels, we're not cesspools either. Their mistake is not that they criticize themselves. Their mistake is that they judge themselves. I know good people who are going through life judging themselves to be flawed and blemished and sometimes hopeless persons. Yes, I worry about good people who judge themselves and always find themselves wanting. But on the other hand, I've known people who made a living by cheating and lying and stealing, who convinced themselves that they were really models of good character. Yes, I worry about people who judge themselves and always find themselves innocent, and I worry about people who find themselves always wanting. No wonder the apostle said to his critics, I not only refuse to let you be my judges, I do not even judge myself. I criticize myself, but I do not judge myself. Which leaves just one more critic, the Lord himself. The apostle not only refused to let his human critics be his judges, he would not let himself be his own judge. But now comes the clincher. It was not as if he refused to be judged by anyone. He had a judge, and he told his critics who his judge was. He said, my judge is the Lord. Now think about that for a moment. God is really qualified to be our judge because he knows us so well, right down to the core, knows everything there is to know about us, the good, the bad, and the indifferent. How can we live with this one critic who really has the competence to be our judge? Let me tell you how I've worked it out. I've found that the way to live with my divine critic is to know that whenever he judges me, he also loves me, forgives me, and accepts me. Nothing I've ever done or ever will do can persuade God to judge and then reject me. Jesus himself had critics who judged him to be deserving of the death penalty. But what his judges did not know was that when they condemned Jesus to death, God himself was in Jesus, taking their judgment of him on himself. And since that moment, when God himself was judged, he is the God, he is the judge who forgives. One last word. We all have to live with critics, that's life. But the only critic who's qualified to be our judge is the Lord himself. And the good news about our divine judge is that he simply refuses to condemn us. Let me put it in the apostles' own words. There is, he said, there is therefore no condemnation. No condemnation. No condemnation at all. There is only forgiveness. And there is only love. God bless you.